each of us has a responsibility to do the work to understand what's going on and not to be easily swayed by talking heads on TV who say, well, this is all anti-Semitic, or this is all virtuous, or this is, it's not those things. It's more complicated than that. And you owe it to the people who are out there protesting sincerely to try to get to their core message and understand it. Now, you don't owe it to them for any other reason that this is how we help make our society work. We listen to other voices. This is democracy. We celebrate that there can be many voices here.
Hello, and welcome to the Politics Girl podcast. I'm your host, Lee McGowan. Let's get into it. I moved some things around this week so I could have my friend David Rothkopf back on the show to talk about what's going on college campuses in America in regards to the Middle East. For those of you who didn't hear David and my conversation back in January regarding the Israel-Gaza Palestinian-Hamas crisis, I would highly recommend you go back and listen to that episode. It gives a lot of history of the conflict, and David offers a lot of important insight into many of the faces of the response since Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, 2023. Today, however, we're going to discuss how the crisis has escalated in America, particularly on American college campuses, and the reaction around the country in response. For those of you who don't know, David is the CEO of the Rothkopf Group, a best-selling author and journalist and host of the Deep State Radio podcast. He served as Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce and International Trade Policy in the Clinton administration, has worked as a professor in international affairs at Columbia University, Georgetown, and Johns Hopkins, and is a contributing columnist to the Daily Beast and a member of the Board of Contributors of USA Today. David has authored hundreds of articles for multiple publications and is a regular commentator on pretty much all broadcast media. He is also a Jewish man who believes in the right of Israel to exist, but was critical of the Americans' unconditional support of the war that was being waged by the Israeli government on the people of Gaza. I'm having him on today to talk about what's going on in the Middle East and much closer to home in our college campuses because I wanted his insight and perspective. And I'm going to say again, as I did the first time we broached this topic, that I understand that I'm not in the position to weigh in fully on any of this, other than to say I'm in full support of Israel's right to exist in peace, the right for Palestinians to exist in peace, and my absolute opposition to terrorism of any kind, like what we saw Hamas inflict on the Israeli people. I am also against any sort of war crimes that we appear to be watching in some form under the terrible leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu. I am adamantly against anti-Semitism in all forms, just as I am against Islamophobia in all of its forms. But I say that acknowledging that I am also not a big fan of organized religion in general, particularly when it causes people to see others as less than or is used as a device for hate and division. I believe we are dealing with a deeply nuanced issue here, but I want to be clear that terror and hate are never the answer, and if that is the route you are taking, I believe you are on the wrong side. Anyway, less from me, more from our guest. Without further ado, please welcome best-selling author, international expert, and brilliant thinker not afraid to ask the hard questions, David Rothkopf. Welcome back, David.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for taking the time to come back so soon. Our conversation in January about this issue was so helpful, and I reached out to you because I've been watching what's been unfolding on college campuses with real uncertainty. I don't believe we're getting the full story from the media, much like the horse race neck and neck thing we're seeing with the presidential race. I feel like they're pushing a narrative with the protests that doesn't tell the full picture, and it leaves us feeling either outraged or confused. And as someone who is a passionate supporter of America's First Amendment rights, I watched Robert Reich say taking a stand against a perceived wrong, or at least provoking a discussion and debate, is what should be happening on our college campuses. But then I question when you get to the point in your protests when you're instilling fear in others, or if your actions are making a targeted minority feel unsafe, or if your school is forced to shutter its doors, or students are being denied access to public spaces or classes based on their faith. And you start to feel like, okay, how much do we accommodate your freedom of expression, and where are we going wrong here? Because I know, as it turns out now, one side of this argument has ended up with the support of some of what I would say are the worst people in the world now, with the Ayatollah behind them and Hamas itself behind the protests here in America. And I think, geez, something has gone wrong here. There should be nothing inherently anti-Semitic about condemning the ongoing destruction that is happening in Gaza. And yet that is not how it's actually playing out around these campuses in America. So please give me your take on this.
Well, first of all, I think your take is clear as a bell and exactly right. We live in a country where we value First Amendment freedoms. They have helped drive us forward throughout our history. They have helped identify, the kind of stars to steer by as we move forward, as we achieve progress, whether it was at the beginning of the country or the Vietnam War or civil rights or apartheid. These kinds of demonstrations are helpful. But having said that, if a demonstration turns to violence, if a demonstration turns to hate speech, if a demonstration disrupts a campus, then it's gone too far. And so you have to have some clear rules that allow for open discourse, that actually encourage it, because that's actually what campuses are supposed to be for, but that do so in a way that ensures that these are safe, that they are not infiltrated by outsiders trying to hijack the events for their own particular purposes, and that are devoid of the kind of provocative or intimidating hate speech that has no place in these discussions. The problem is, you turn on the TV and, there are all these analysts. It's kind of become like a Rorschach test, because every analyst sees in this what they want to see. And if you're looking for anti-Semitism, then you're going to say that's what they're about. And if you think Hamas is on campus, you're going to say this is Hamas. And if you oppose the war in Gaza, you're going to say, well, this is just a natural way to express all that. When you turn on the TV, you see people emphasizing things that aren't at the center of this. Most of these protests are peaceful. Most of these protests do not involve hate speech. Most of these protests are simply oriented towards one, to my mind, extremely reasonable goal, which is stopping the killing of innocent civilians in Gaza or anywhere. And if students, my friend Ed Luce at the Financial Times has a column today, and, he said, if the students on our campuses were not protesting the kind of killing that's going on in Gaza, then we would have an even bigger problem.
Yeah. I just feel incredibly uncomfortable with the word Zionist becoming a bad word, because I was under the impression, and you tell me, because clearly I'm a massive WASP, but I was under the impression that Zionist meant you believed in the right for Israel to exist, the right for Jewish people to have a safe place in the world. And now we're seeing people writing and equating the word Zionist with these terrible geopolitical politics of the Netanyahu government. And I don't think those two things are the same. I watched, videos of kids dressed in their pro-Palestinian clothing at UCLA, denying access to pathways and classes in the library to children who had Stars of David and things based on their faith. And I watched a bunch of students ask a Jewish student if he was a Zionist. And then they said, well, we're not letting Zionists in. And to me, that's atrocious, not to mention a complete violation of the students' civil rights and their place at the school. And I feel like I don't know how we got to this place where this is the way we're speaking about the conflict.
Well, again, it's complicated. A lot of it goes back to the conversation that we had earlier this year. But some parts of it aren't complicated. If somebody's blocking the path of a student to get to a class, they shouldn't be doing that. If somebody is telling a student because of their beliefs that they're going to be blocked, they shouldn't be doing that. If they are an outsider and they're provoking this, and at UCLA, there seems to be a lot of examples of that, including a bunch that came on and tore down the encampment by expressing the opposite views, they should be taken away. That there's no place for that in there. Now you get to a second view, and that is the question of the use of the term Zionist. And this one is one of those where, we could spend the next hour deconstructing where these terms come from. But here's the reality. The term Zionist represented a political movement. It's not a religious term, right? It represented a political movement by a group of people who felt that Jews should have their own homeland. Now, this movement, which started around the turn of the last century, ultimately led to the establishment of the state of Israel. There are a lot of Jews who were not supportive of this movement, some because they're extreme religious views, others because they may have other kinds of views about how a state should be organized or whether there was a fair claim to the state that was made by Israel. One of the problems that has happened in this whole Gaza debate is that a number of groups, some well-meaning groups, but they've gone and said, well, if you oppose Zionism, you're an anti-Semite. Well, that's ridiculous. That's just ridiculous.
Why is that ridiculous?
Well, because, first of all, you might oppose Zionism because you believe in separation of church and state. You might oppose Zionism because the Zionist state, as it has been created now, doesn't adhere to other principles that you value. For example, as an American, I believe that the legitimacy of a government derives from the consent of the governed. But there are people who are within borders controlled by Israel who do not have a say in the outcome of the government, whether it's in the West Bank or in Gaza. And so you might say, well, the idea of Zionism is appealing to me, or the idea that Jews should have a state is appealing to me. But the fact of it, the reality of it, the way it has been manifested has some problems, and I may oppose those problems. And it gets a little bit like the discussion that has existed here, where a lot of people who are pro the Netanyahu government have been trying to sell an argument that any criticism of their government is anti-Semitic, that if you criticize Israel, you're an anti-Semite. But of course, there are vast numbers of people in Israel, a majority of people in Israel that don't support the Netanyahu government. So it's not anti-Semitic for all those Jews not to like this government that has caused so much mayhem, corruption. It's just a terrible government full of extremist people. But this is where we get into the real problem here. Different groups are trying to claim terms. I mean, the White House yesterday, and I'm very supportive of the White House in most of what they do, put out a statement saying that the term intifada is a hateful term. Intifada just means uprising. There are people who say, and this will be controversial to some of your listeners, but there are people who say the term from the river to the sea is a hateful term because it implies that there will be no Jews between the river and the sea, and that this implies cleansing, away the Jews from that image of what a Palestinian state is.
And does it not mean that? Because you do hear that in songs, in chants.
It could mean that, and it depends on the context. But the view of Israel that is offered by the Netanyahu government is of an Israel that extends from the river to the sea. It is of an Israel that negates the rights and claims of Palestinians to that land. And it has manifested itself in dislocating Palestinians from their settlements in the West Bank. It has manifested itself in this onslaught against Gaza. And so, this is where, do you remember the Claudine Gay, the president of Harvard, and she goes and she's asked, what do you do about this kind of thing? And she said, well, it all depends on context. And so she then gets fired. But it all depends on context. It's perfectly reasonable to have a conversation like you and I are having in a seminar at a university looking at the various sides of this debate. It's not reasonable to say from the river to the sea through a bullhorn when you're standing outside the Hillel trying to intimidate Jewish students from going about their business on a campus. And the problem is that there are a lot of people who try to exploit this, interest groups that, represent one side or another in this thing. People who want to distract from the real discussion about the damage that's been done by the Israelis. And that's why, I heard one leader say, well, the pro-Iranian, pro-Hamas protests are, a scandal and they should be shut down. Well, most of these people aren't pro-Iranian. Most of them aren't pro-Hamas. Would it be bad if you were pro the revolutionary Iranian government and pro-Hamas? Yes, it would. But they're trying to conflate all this because it suits them in making their arguments. And I think we as reasonable observers have got to stand back and say, well, who among these protesters are students who are sincere in their concerns about the innocent people of Gaza? Who among them are Jewish? Who among them are of other groups that could not possibly support Hamas? Who among them are presenting themselves in a peaceful, reasonable way? And those people deserve their time on the stage to make their case. If you cross the line towards intimidation, violence, hate speech, disruption of the campus, disruption of the rules, established rules of the campus, then you're not entitled to say anything you want in any way you want.
Yeah, which comes back to context, which of course in these kind of situations we don't always get. We don't get nuance, we don't get context. Personally, I've heard numerous conflicting but firsthand stories. One is of a daughter of a friend of mine who is a Jewish student at Barnard, which is attached to Columbia, if people don't know. And she attended a Shabbat and Seder on the lawn and hung out with friends and sang with Muslim and Jewish people until 3 a.m. And it was this wonderful healing experience for her. And then my dear friend's son, who is also a Jewish American college student in New York, was locked in a building for his own safety because the protesters were a danger to him. And he was told to hide his Star of David necklace, and he was terrified. Now, I've heard kids say that they hate the encampment, and I have kids say that they think the encampment is essential to protest the slaughter of these innocents in Gaza. But as you're saying, once these protesters, who you can definitely argue the majority are there protesting something justified, are being joined by outside groups like the Proud Boys or backed by the Iranian Ayatollah or endorsed by Hamas itself, it suddenly becomes less clear that we're not just dealing with an anti-war protest, which we can and which we know has worked in the past, but it is now something different. And these groups that are supporting the protesters, these are people that openly hate the Jewish people and want to see the state of Israel destroyed. So then the pro-Palestinian contingent becomes a different coalition if their allies themselves are anti-Jewish advocates, no? Like if I was at a protest and the KKK showed up and I'm a white girl and the KKK showed up, I'd be like, well, shit, I can't stand here anymore, even though I know that what I'm protesting is real. But once the KKK showed up and stands beside me, how can I stand there anymore as a white woman, right? I can't stand beside the KKK, even if what I'm protesting is justified.
Right. And as a acquaintance of mine said yesterday in a social media discussion on this, if you're there and you're protesting something sincerely, like, the slaughter in Gaza, and somebody walks up to you and starts saying anti-Semitic things or fomenting violence, walk away, leave. Don't participate in that, because we have a civic responsibility to ensure that the messages aren't muddled. Now, some of the things you said are a little more problematic. So, for example, if the Ayatollah says, I support these protests, well, that doesn't devalue everything that's been said in a protest that's fair and reasonable. He's just trying to ride it for his own purposes. So That isn't automatically bad. But if you're standing there next to some Proud Boy and they're, stirring things up, and by the way, they're not pro-Jewish either, right? But if you're
they're definitely not.
Right. But if you're standing next to one of them and you go along with it, if you tolerate it, then you're complicit, and that's on you. And so where you begin with, and a lot of campuses have not had big problems with this, is having very clear rules. You may speak, you may demonstrate. You need to do so in a certain place. If you do so in a public place, you may need a certain kind of permission. You can't do it in this place. You can't block people's access. There can't be outsiders involved in it. You can't do it in an intimidating way, whatever it is. And once you have rules like that, then it's quite easy for the administration to say, well, you're in violation of the rules, and so you're going to pay a price for that. If you're making up the rules as you go along, then you get into another kind of a problem. And that's what's happened, particularly in Colombia, where, all of a sudden we've got the New York City Police Department getting involved in this thing, people who are, licensed to use force, who tend to be brought into violent situations that are almost inevitably going to escalate the violence that's associated with this. And that's happened in Texas, it's happened in California, and so forth. And look, there's another perspective on this. I went to Colombia. In fact, and this sounds like, an advertisement for my family, but it's not. My daughters went to Colombia. My parents went to Colombia. My grandparents went to Colombia. My great-grandparents went to Colombia. I taught at Colombia. My dad taught at Colombia. My grandfather taught at Colombia. I feel deeply involved in Colombia. I went to Colombia in the mid to late 70s. And I went to Colombia because there had been demonstrations there in the late 60s and early 70s. And I wanted to be part of that kind of activism. Now, subsequent generations went to Colombia in spite of the fact that there had been those kind of demonstrations there. But, a tradition of campus activism is not a bad thing. And I would add, one dimension of this that is not really covered is what it all actually really means, for American politics and for policy in America. Let's look back. Civil rights demonstrations, Vietnam War demonstrations. When I was at Columbia, there were big demonstrations to free Soviet Jewry, to divest from South Africa in order to end apartheid. There were demonstrations against American wars throughout. Every time there is a war, there were BLM demonstrations. There have been all sorts of demonstrations there. Almost always the demonstrations, even though they make somebody uncomfortable, end up signaling where public policy is going. This is the younger generation. They are exposing us to the beliefs and views they've got. And I think one of the things that's particularly disturbing to the Netanyahu hard Israeli right, mainstream traditional pro-Israel organizations in the U.S., is that what these demonstrations signal is that U.S. views, the views of the next generation towards Israel, are not as reflexive as they were. They're not automatic. People have got to live up to this idea of shared values in the relationship, which the current Israeli government has drifted away from. And so I think another thing we ought to do as we look at this is say, well, what does this tell you? Because now it's coast to coast. There's a lot of places that's going and having this kind of thing. What does it tell you about prevailing or potentially prevailing views in our own body politic?
Yeah. I think the Netanyahu government being far right-wing, and obviously Netanyahu himself has some sort of benefit in this war continuing because the majority of his country is not behind him. Most people want him replaced when the war is over. So it behooves him to keep the war going. In some ways, it reminds me a lot of what we're doing here. Like if Trump was in charge and Trump had done something outrageous and people were saying, what are Americans doing? This is terrible, death to America because of our behavior. It would be very hard for certain Americans because we'd be like, this isn't us. This is our government, and I think that's in some ways what's happening in Israel. I just feel like here on American soil, because I feel like this is a 70-plus-year-old geopolitical conflict, which we have been dealing with and we talked about months ago. The history of it, how much is going on there. But what's happening here on American soil we know there's outside groups. Like I watched a video this morning, and we are recording this discussion on Wednesday, May 1st. And a swarm of pro-Palestinian kids were chasing down a Jewish student until he got trapped against the side of a building and then fell to his knees and put his hands up. And watching it on my phone, it felt so Lord of the Flies-ish, right? It felt groupthink. It felt very terrifying. And I know there's outside groups whose motives and identities are not clear. And they're now regularly sort of riling up these protests. And these student groups at Columbia have, they've formally complained about the presence of outsiders, which is obviously something very difficult for these universities to police, considering how open these urban campuses are, how common it's become to protest, how many people are wearing masks. And so now we have this bad faith domestic and foreign actors pumping up and supporting these protesters on social media, attempting to build them up into something that undermines the Biden campaign, which I think we can't but notice, undermining Jewish people in general, undermining the state of Israel, which, as you say, might be a thing that we need to question. That it might be that people are like, are we going to blindly support Israel moving forward? Or do we want to say, hey, these are not our shared values anymore, and we would like to see something different? I think a lot of Israelis would like to see something different. Whatever the intent, it's hard not to feel like a lot of these students are becoming pawns in a bigger game that they might not be part of. Do you see that at all? Because I don't think that American college students should be afraid of their fellow American college students simply because they're Jewish or simply because they don't believe the same thing. And I don't see how Jewish people around the world should be blamed for the behavior of a nationalistic right-wing government's response to war. If I asked you how many subscriptions you have right now, would you be able to tell me? How about how much they cost? Most people think they could, and most people are wrong. In fact, 75% of people have subscriptions they've completely forgotten about. 75%. It's amazing how much money these companies are making off us, and we don't even know. That's why Rocket Money is so helpful. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It shows you all your subscriptions in one place, and if there's something you don't want or can no longer afford, Rocket Money can help you cancel it with a few taps. Rocket Money will even try and negotiate for you to get a refund for the last couple of months of wasted money, and negotiate to lower your bills for up to 20%. All you have to do is take a picture of your bill, and Rocket Money does the rest. It's a terrific service, which is probably why Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving its members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's features. So stop wasting money on things you don't use and cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/politicsgirl. That's rocketmoney.com/politicsgirl. rocketmoney.com/politicsgirl. Support for today's episode comes from Honeylove. Honeylove has revolutionized the bra game by saying goodbye to underwire without sacrificing lift. Honeylove's bras feature supportive bonding that eliminate the need for uncomfortable wires and offers a wide range of sizes while catering to the diverse needs of all women. It might just be the time to spring clean that bra drawer. If you're someone in my audience who wears bras, or someone who would buy a bra or shapewear for someone else, then Honeylove is a company you should really check out. Bras shouldn't cause bulging in the back. They shouldn't dig into your shoulders or ride up, and your shapewear shouldn't take away all your curves and turn you into someone else's version of what you should look like. If you want a go-to bra, it's the crossover. It's comfortable and supportive without the wires. If you want something more relaxed, I recommend the V, that gives you all the comfort but without that dreaded uniboob look. Their shapewear has the signature X, which targets and sculpts your midsection without squeezing out all your natural curves, and it won't ever roll down thanks to their flexible boning hidden in the sides. These are products that will make you look good and feel good. As Honeylove says, they aren't just supporting women, they're empowering women. So treat yourself to the best bras and shapewear on the market and save up to 20% off at honeylove.com/politicsgirl. Use our exclusive link to get 20% off at honeylove.com/politicsgirl to find your perfect fit. And after your purchase, when they ask you where you heard about them, please support the show and tell them that we sent you. Free the pain and discomfort. Keep the support with Honeylove. As they say, honey, you deserve this. honeylove.com/politicsgirl. Today's podcast is sponsored by Sundays for Dogs. you have heard me talking about my beloved Golden Doodle chips and his devotion to Sundays for Dogs. Sundays for Dogs is a fresh dog food made from a short list of human-grade ingredients. It was co-founded by a practicing veterinarian who tests and formulates every version of each recipe. Sundays contains 90% meat, 10% superfoods, and 0% synthetic nutrients or artificial ingredients. And unlike other fresh dog foods, Sundays doesn't require refrigeration or preparation because of their air drying process, so you can just pour and serve. I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I love my boy, but he is a picky eater with a sensitive stomach, so getting him food that he likes and is also good for him has been a production. But Sundays for Dogs has made it so easy. He likes the beef, he likes the chicken, his stomach seems normal and settled. It's been really impressive. Plus, it's so easy to serve. I'm not making as much garbage with the canned foods, and it's delivered to my home on a reoccurring order. So I'm making far fewer trips to the vet for their specialty food and their terrible, terrible parking. If you want to try this terrific food for your dog, go to sundaysfordogs.com/politicsgirl to get 40% off your first order. That's sundaysfordogs.com/politicsgirl, or use the code politicsgirl at checkout for 40% off. Because I'm sure your dog is just as special to you as my chips is to me, and they deserve food they actually want to eat and is good for them. sundaysfordogs.com/politicsgirl. I don't see how Jewish people around the world should be blamed for the behavior of a nationalistic right-wing government's response to war.
Well, but again, you're the most commonsensical person out here talking about these issues on a regular basis. And the reality is, of course, what you're saying is true. That's a horrible story about people chasing down a Jewish kid and him being terrified and so forth. And of course, Jews shouldn't be blamed for that government. By the same token, that government shouldn't be able to use the Jewishness of the state it represents as a shield to protect it from criticism when it does horrible things. And Palestinian protesters or people who are reasonably offended by the death of tens of thousands of innocent people in Gaza should not be immediately redefined or defamed by the action of a group of people who may be outside agitators who may not be actually expressing their own views. And so that's why it's really important that you read good analysis. And by the way, there are a lot of student journalists out there who are covering these things. I know at Columbia, the Columbia Spectator and the radio station WKCR have been covering these things extremely well. Students from the journalism school have been covering this extremely well. Go find reports, because you'll find just what you have described. The vast majority of reports are of peaceful encampment, people getting along, kids lying on the lawn, talking to each other, eating meals. It's not a violent thing. There are reports of outsiders, very disturbing. There are reports of people with extreme views. We don't know who they are, very disturbing. And we need to be able to unravel this. We need to be able to unravel it. What's the prevailing underlying objective? Is there a sincere point of view we need to hear here? Are there people trying to distort that perspective? How do we get them out of it? Are there people making these campuses more unsafe? How do we get them out of here? How do we get back to the tradition of open exchange, intellectual discourse, freedom of expression, which is essential to the college campus experience, and enable people with a real point of view to present that point of view and be heard? Because that's just as important as ensuring that it's a safe space. And one of the things that I worry about is that there are a lot of people out there, particularly people on the right in the United States, who would just as soon see campus discourse shut down or limit points of view that are not their points of view. That's why you have Elise Stefanik going after these Ivy League university presidents as if all of a sudden she cared a lot about the Jews, when the guy she loves, the president she supported, Donald Trump, was the one who said they're fine people on both sides in Charlottesville, is the one who kept, Hitler speeches by his bed, is, deeply and demonstrably known to have, anti-Semitic feelings, even if he has some Jewish family members. The muddling of these issues together suits people with cynical motives. And we, as observers, need to actually do a little more work to find out what's real, what's being played up by one side or another side to suit their goals. And to also ask ourselves whether there are any questions being posed here that really deserve some public debate. Like, this week, it may be that the International Criminal Court issues arrest warrants for Bibi Netanyahu and some of his generals.
And the Hamas people, both, which I think is fascinating.
Fascinating. And also, and I'm just going to take a big leap here, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but perfectly reasonable. If people commit war crimes on either side, hold them to it. Now, but the U.S. government is saying, oh, no, we don't believe in this stuff, which gets us into a whole other issue because the U.S. government doesn't like the International Criminal Court because we do horrible things periodically, and we don't want to be held to account for them. But anyway, I mean, the point is these are incredibly important, complex issues, and they really do require the kind of systematic deconstruction that you do here, where you sort of say, okay, what's the good, what's the bad, who's sincere, who's insincere, who's got a political motive, who does not, what belongs in public discourse, what doesn't. And there's no simple answer. If you just want to be able to sort of say, oh yeah, these are bad or these are good. And by the way, that's what most of the discussions are that I hear on TV.
There's not a lot of nuance. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all BS.
I mean, listen, there's no excuse for the way certain Jewish students are being treated. Like, there's just no excuse for that at all. I do think that there are deeply evil forces using the goodness that I think the majority of these student protesters have for their own ends. I think we need to acknowledge that the original attack on Israel was done by Hamas, and it was bankrolled and supported by most definitely Iran and Russia. And there's no way to not see that all connected in an election year in America. I don't think we can pretend that we're doing this within a vacuum. And I think that is something we do also need to acknowledge. It's hard not to feel like the goodness of American students who truly believe in helping others, stopping the slaughter, doing the right thing in the world, who have been raised in a culture of freedom of expression, freedom of protest, to stand up for the rights of other people, to stand up for those who are weaker than you. In some ways, I feel like I don't want to see these groups who are doing this from a purely good point of view being manipulated, because there's been lots of slaughters around the world, right? Like, we had huge genocide in Syria, huge genocide in Sudan. What's happening with the Uyghurs in China is absolutely atrocious. And yet college students weren't out in force for this. So it's hard not to see that this crisis in Gaza, a crisis that we have to be honest was started by the leadership of Gaza when they attacked Israel in the first place, is being pushed and fed by outside forces so that the pureness of what these students started to stand up for is now being manipulated. And then, of course, you mentioned the police, right? And I think we need to be really honest that these protests are becoming very politicized. Having the police called in to deal with these protesters, and then you see this horrible footage of the American police forces brutalizing protesters. And I feel like, oh, great, now we're dealing with yet another problem, and a very American problem, which is the over-militarization and the violence of American law enforcement. And it really feels like our enemies are using multiple weaknesses against us, which is clever if you're in a proxy war of sorts. Our hope, our faith, our democracy, our right to peacefully protest, even the fact that we have a problem with our police, it's all kind of coming to a head in America right now. It feels manipulated by outside forces. Do you see that at all? Or am I conflating that in my mind?
No, you're exactly right. And I think but it's being manipulated on both sides. And you have to see it as being manipulated on both sides. There are people, Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday, well, these campus protests are like the German protests of the 1930s. Well, like, slow your roll there, buddy. That's not exactly what they are. And, we talked about this the last time I was on here. I think it's perfectly reasonable for somebody to be appalled by Hamas, appalled by the Hamas attacks on October 7th, disgusted by what they did in every respect, want the hostages to be freed, and also to be appalled by the killing of innocent Gazans. This was my naive view. I've only been doing this 30 years, but my naive view was that if I opposed the killing of innocents on both sides, that would be seen as a reasonable position. But this is so overheated, this environment, that if I say something like, oh, we shouldn't kill those Gazans, guess what? They come down like a ton of bricks on me. I have been called an anti-Semite. Son of Holocaust survivor, have been called an anti-Semite because I think that we should take the humanity of the people of Gaza into consideration here. And by the way, I don't recall many debates like this in my life. It's so overheated. It's so impossible to have a nuanced discussion with your friends. With your friends, it's hard to have a nuanced discussion because people are like deeply on one side or deeply on the other side, and they're missing the point. For universities, it helps to have rules and principles. For people, it helps to have rules and principles. You got to go back to your core beliefs and say, what do I think is good? What do I think is bad? And then you've got to do the work to find out what's really happening.
You mentioned it in that the Republicans are out in full force, denouncing the protests. And the Democrats are getting blamed for both not supporting Israel enough and helping Israel too much, right? So President Biden has been incredibly clear that the U.S. commitment to Israel's security against threats from, say, Iran and its proxies is unwavering. So I'm finding it interesting that Jewish and Muslim Americans are questioning if Trump is a better leader for them, that Joe Biden is somehow letting them down. Can you talk me through the politics of that a little bit? Because I feel a little like, seriously, Muslim man guy is going to be better for you? Like, it seems astounding to me. And yet I can see if you have taken the nuance out of it and you're standing on one side or the other, and you're saying, these people attacked us, how could we possibly be victimized for that? This is entirely wrong. And then you say, yes, but the response to that was also wrong. Can we criticize that? And you say, no, we cannot. Then you get this kind of dichotomy in which there is no nuance, there is no room, you said, for discussion, even amongst your friends. And then that leads you to someone who is far more extreme, and you end up with a Netanyahu here in America.
Yeah, well, look, it's tribalism. Tribalism is a situation where you put the beliefs of the tribe ahead of your own, and you do what you think is consistent with the views of the tribe. And you twist everything to suit the needs of the tribe. So if your tribe is pro-Trump, then you sort of say, well, then we got to have Trump. If you look at Trump's treatment of Muslims, if you look at Trump's treatment of the Israel-Gaza crisis, if you look at Trump's competence as a president, if you look at Trump's character, you got to have your head examined if you would support Trump for anything with the argument that somehow he would be better at this. Biden hasn't done a perfect job at this. I think the U.S. government has supported the Israeli in their assault on Gaza too much, have not used the leverage we have to the extent that we should. But these are complicated issues. And he was also trying to deal with the Iran threat, and he was trying to deal with the long-standing relationship with Israel. And they went and they seriously sat down, grappled with them, made policy. And when the policy was wrong, they've tried to evolve the policy. That's not how Trump works. Trump has already said he's going to round up immigrants, including Muslims, put them into concentration camps, and send them out of the country with the assistance of the United States Armed Forces. I mean, how can you support that? And Trump supports, you talked about who's behind all this. Trump supports Putin. Putin is, an ally of Iran and supportive of Hamas and so forth. This gets us a little bit back to the core issue, which is people interpret this problem. And this happens with so much nowadays. People tend to interpret or analyze what's going on in a way that suits their pre-existing beliefs and without sufficient regard for the facts.
So what do we do about that? How do we add nuance to a conversation that has so little nuance?
It's what you do every day here.
I wish more people listen to me.
Well, I hope they do too. And we've got our own little podcast network, and we do. And fortunately, and this is something nobody wants to talk about, particularly the New York Times, because they're angry about it. But we live in a golden age of journalism. We live in a golden age where so many voices can present themselves. You could go and set up a studio in your house and reach tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people each and every year. You don't have to own a TV network. You don't have to be a gajillionaire, and you can make a difference. So there are a lot of voices. There are a lot of places out there as a result of that where you can find nuance, where you can find, my network, I think we do 15 or 17 podcasts a week now, but they're all expert based. What we try to do is we try to find experts. And I know this is what you do. And you try to get expert perspectives and give people perspective. And so you may not get that on cable news, but there are a lot of places you can find it. It's out there. And I think we really need to appreciate that. There's a lot about the media environment today that offers great richness to people who seek it out.
Yeah. Well, speaking of outside sources, I was listening to Simon Rosenberg talk about this topic, and he summed up what I've been thinking pretty well. He said, I support the right to protest. Universities should not be bringing in police with riot gear. Bibi Netanyahu is a historic failure. He's a malevolent global force that needs to go. Too many Gazans have died, but we need to have a serious conversation about these protests and their tactics, right? Far too often, these protesters around America, whether it's through ignorance or malice, as Rosenberg says, it becomes a cross between being pro-Palestinian to leaning into supporting what is essentially its own genocidal axis of Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, Russia. And then when you start standing next to someone who's calling for the elimination of Israel and the Jews, like you said, if you are a good person there for good reasons, you have to say, I'm not part of this, and you must walk away. You have to see the nuance in it. And these moments where protests transfer from being peaceful to calling for war and violence against Israel, against the US, against the West in general, we can't be supporting that. And I think that that is something we need to keep coming back to, right? That the tactics that these protesters have gone to, beyond peaceful protest, to disrupting events, to shutting down traffic, to illegally occupying property. These are things we need to say, this doesn't stand up with our values. The same way we would say to the Netanyahu government, the way you are behaving, though we are your ally, does not stand up to our values. And I think, like you said, we have to come back to having rules and principles. We have to have rules and principles as protesters. We have to have rules and principles as citizens. We have to have rules and principles as players on the global stage. What would you like the audience to remember after leaving this discussion? How do you think we're going to find our way out of this mess? What do you think we should be considering? Or what do you think we should be asking of our leaders at universities and in government to be doing at this time that, as you said, is getting so heated?
I think you've just posed it in several ways. The people who run universities and mayors and so forth need to approach this with a recognition that open discourse in a university is a core principle and that it needs to be protected, even if some of what the protesters say is uncomfortable for people. But that conducting it in the context of a safe space and stripping away anything that may be considered intimidating or inciting to violence is critical. Outsiders don't have a place in this. There've got to be clear rules. Generally speaking, keep the police off the campuses. Let the campuses resolve these things on their own. Adding a, sort of paramilitary element to these discussions doesn't help it. But I think the other part of it is that each of us has a responsibility to do the work to understand what's going on and not to be easily swayed by talking heads on TV who say, well, this is all anti-Semitic, or this is all virtuous, or this is, it's not those things. It's more complicated than that. And you owe it to the people who are out there protesting sincerely to try to get to their core message and understand it. Now, you don't owe it to them for any other reason that this is how we help make our society work. We listen to other voices. This is democracy. We celebrate that there can be many voices here. And I think we also need to just sort of dial it back a bit. Don't immediately assume that a phrase is a triggering phrase. Don't immediately assume that the worst about somebody who's presenting a point of view that's different from yours. I don't care what the Proud Boys have to say. I don't care what Hamas has to say. I don't care what the Ayatollahs have to say. Those are bad people. Edit them out. But there are legitimate debates at the core of this. And I think we need to hear the legitimate debates and hear both sides of those debates and recognize at the core that if there are demonstrations occurring coast to coast in the United States, in universities, something's going on. Students are unhappy with the way U.S. policy is being shaped, with the way global events are being shaped, and they want a voice. If I were Bibi Netanyahu or I were the right wing in Israel, and I had sort of said, well, I can always count on the U.S. to back us up no matter what we do, that train has left the station. The United States is going to look more critically going forward because this generation of Americans are going to view the Israelis as being the authors of this slaughter in Gaza, as well as being the victims of October 7th. They're going to have a different point of view than generations that came before. And in terms of long-term policy, that matters a lot too. But at a time when everybody else is getting overheated, it serves us best to try to remain as dispassionate as we can be and look for the facts.
Yeah. I know I could talk to you about this for days. It's hard for me not to mention, though, like you mentioned October 7th. What do we do if we say there is a legitimate argument that Israel is not the same Israel it was, that it's not necessarily sharing our values, that yes, absolutely, we can support the Jewish people and we should support the state of Israel, but their reaction here has been too much, too hard, too fast. But what do we do when we say October 7th did happen? What would America do, say, if a bunch of people from Mexico came across the border and raped and murdered a bunch of our people and took a bunch of hostages and went back across Mexico? I'm pretty sure everyone in America would say we would destroy them with hell's fire and we would bomb the crap out of Mexico, and no one would be like, well, that's a terrible thing to do. We'd be like, that's what you get for attacking America. So I think people have a really hard time understanding that we're supposed to say, yes, we were attacked. You have said you're coming back to kill us again. You have said you want us destroyed. And yet we're supposed to be on the other side of that. What do I tell people who are feeling that? Because that does seem unfair and unjust to the people of Israel who were the ones attacked in the first place. Despite the fact that I think the Netanyahu government is the worst and has to go. What do I say to people like that? Because to my Jewish friends and family, I think this is atrocious what's happening to them. And I do see a rise in anti-Semitism all around the country. And so I believe in the protest and the right to protest. I believe in the original fact, and what is happening to the Palestinians is wrong. But what do you say as a Jewish man yourself to people who say, but we were the victims of this? How is this possibly our people being attacked on college campuses, being targeted? How is this possibly a nuanced discussion?
Well, I mean, the facts of it are nuanced. You know, Hamas was supported prior to this by revenue flows that Bibi Netanyahu allowed to go because it was his strategy to prop up Hamas in order to ensure that the Palestinian leadership was divided. And similarly, Hamas had an opportunity to strike Israel in the south because the Israeli leadership had ignored the warnings of an attack and had shifted most of their troops to the north, to the West Bank. And so they have some culpability there, and they have yet to explore all of that. Secondly, you know, we don't need a hypothetical. The United States was attacked on September 11th, 2001. And what was our response? It was fucking insane. We went in and laid waste to a country that had nothing to do with the attack. And probably 600 to 700,000 innocent people died as a result. That was the biggest failure of U.S. foreign policy. It was profoundly immoral. That was the wrong response to have here. Is it natural that Israel would want to strike out against Hamas? Yes. But there are certain rules for engagement in warfare where if you enter a territory to seek out an enemy, you have a responsibility to protect citizens to a degree to which they have not. You have a responsibility to allow in humanitarian aid to a degree to which they have not. You have a responsibility to your own people to pursue a policy that actually enhances your security. Their policy has not enhanced their security. It has not achieved their goals. And there is just simply the arithmetic of morality. If 1,000 Israelis died in horrific ways on October 7th, is 35,000 dead Palestinians, you know, a proportional response? 70,000 injured Palestinians, a proportional response? A famine that may affect as well 1 million Palestinians, proportional response? Gaza is gone. Gaza is a pile of rubble. So, did the Israelis have a right to respond? Yes. Did they have certain obligations that they did not adhere to appropriately? Also, yes, I think. And that's what gets us into the problem here. If you want this to be simple, you're looking in the wrong place. This is not simple. This is difficult. It requires grown-ups who have a sense of history, who have the ability to weigh different competing ideas and carry them at the same time in their minds, to be able to handle and to analyze and to come out in the right place on this kind of thing. And the same is true with these battles on the campus. This is not one side good, the other side bad. George Orwell, Animal Farm, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. It is not that. This is a lot of well-meaning people trying to achieve something positive who have also had alongside them people who have hijacked their message, perverted it, and they've also had amongst them people with extreme and hateful views who ought to be condemned for those hateful views. Wish it were all simple. It's not. That's the way the world is. You want something simple? Go to the U.S. presidential election. Joe Biden is good. Donald Trump is bad.
I agree with that. There you go. Look, at the end of the day, I really hope, as Rosenberg also writes, that these universities and colleges are already planning how to use these protests to create a respectful and serious wide campus discussion and debate in the fall, that we can actually open a real discussion about this, that we might be able to use these protests as a teaching moment for the next generation rather than having it devolve the way it is right now into hate and violence, that it is best that we have a constructive next chapter in this conversation, and we shouldn't fear the debate. We shouldn't fear the nuance. We shouldn't fear this. We should welcome it while still saying that there's no room for hate and violence. There's no room for targeting of minorities. There's no room for children being scared on their own campuses. And quite frankly, these kids deserve their graduation, and they deserve a sense of security in their own universities. And we need to work for that, to give them that. I want to thank you so much for coming today, David. You're such a pleasure to speak to. And I wish more people could talk like this. I think we have to come back to what you said. In reality, we need a bunch of grown-ups with a sense of history who can have these discussions. And again, that comes right back to leadership. We have a presidential election this year. We have to make sure we're choosing the grown-ups in the room, because the world is a messy place, and we need people that can't just separate it into black and white and understand that there's going to be millions of shades of gray if we're going to make real decisions that help real people.
You do that here all the time on your podcast, and I think it's real important, and that's why it's always a pleasure to come here and talk to you.
Thank you. So that was David Rothkopf, reminding us that we require leadership of both our governments and our universities who are grown-ups with a sense of history and nuance. That our tendency to be tribal has turned these conflicts on university campuses into a Rorschach test where people see what they want to see. That it's essential that our universities and our people have rules and principles rather than simply making things up as they go along. This gives us a structure in which to function safely and makes things more fair. If you break the rules, there should be consequences. If you don't live up to the principles, you will be held accountable. We should be able to say that every American citizen has the right to protest, but not to dominate or intimidate. We need to be able to acknowledge that when we, in good faith, stand alongside someone working in bad faith, we must walk away, rather than being a pawn of outside forces that do not align with our values. We can be unwavering in our belief that our students deserve to be safe and protected, while still believing that other students deserve to be heard and respected. This is a conflict that will no doubt continue, but we need to be aware of those trying to use this conflict to their advantage. We can support the Jewish people, the Jewish state, and the Jewish faith while still being critical of the actions and values of the Israeli government. Just as we can want to protect the innocents in Gaza while still acknowledging that the actions and values of their leadership is completely unacceptable. To me, this keeps coming back to leadership. Bad leaders, whether they be leaders of a protest group, a university, or a government, can make bad decisions that hurt a lot of people. And bad leaders are usually the ones who take nuance and responsibility and values out of the equation. We see it in Israel, we see it in Gaza, and we need to be very careful that we don't elect it in America. I want to thank David for joining us today, and you for caring enough about democracy to be here. Until next week, PG out. The Politics Girl podcast is written and performed by me, Lee McGowan, in partnership with the Midas Media Network, and produced and edited by Happy Warrior Entertainment. All rights reserved.